The map was wrong, not the distances, not the coordinates. The paper was accurate down to the last mile, but the map was still wrong because the map told you what was possible. And Captain James Harlow had stopped believing in what was possible a long time ago. It was 2 in the morning. The rest of Fenton Airfield was asleep, or trying to be. The barracks were quiet except for the sound of men rolling over on cots that were too small, in a heat that never really went away, not even at night. The Australian outback didn't cool down after sunset. It just shifted from a dry, open furnace to a closed, suffocating one. Harlow stood alone in the operations room, a single lamp burning on the table in front of him. The map was spread out under that lamp. He had looked at it every day for 3 months. He knew every island, every strait, every meaningless stretch of blue water between where he was standing and where he needed to be. He put his finger on Fenton. Then he walked it north, across the Timor Sea, past the coast of the Dutch East Indies, over the Makassar Strait, all the way to a small city on the northwest coast of Borneo, Balikpapan. He pulled his hand back and looked at the distance between his starting point and where his finger had stopped. Then he looked at the B-24 sitting on the tarmac outside the window, a big, dark shape in the darkness. 4 engines, long wings, a belly full of what the engineers called promise. Then he looked at his finger again. He folded the map in half, set it down, and said quietly to no one in the room, "Throw the book away." The men of the 381st Bomb Group had a name for themselves. They called themselves the Lone Rangers. It was partly a joke, partly a statement of fact. Nobody else was crazy enough to operate this far out. The nearest major Allied airbase was hundreds of miles away. The nearest friendly city felt like another planet. Fenton wasn't really a base, it was a scar. Someone had taken heavy machinery to a flat piece of red dirt in the Northern Territory and scraped out a runway, thrown up some tin-roofed structures, and called it a military installation. The flies were so thick in the mornings that men ate with one hand waving in front of their faces. The heat in the afternoon was not weather. It was a physical force that pressed down on your shoulders and made every step feel like you were moving through wet cement. Their weapon was the B-24 Liberator. Back home, the newspapers wrote about the B-24 in the language of gods and giants. Heavy bomber, 4 engines, long range, a flying fortress bristling with machine guns, the kind of language that made mothers feel proud and made generals feel powerful. The crews at Fenton had different words for it. They called it the flying brick. They called it the aluminum coffin. The B-24 was heavy on the controls. It shook in crosswinds. It burned fuel like a sick man burns fever. And it had a range, a hard, fixed limit of roughly 800 miles in combat configuration. 800 miles. In Europe, that was enough. You took off from England, crossed the Channel, hit a target in occupied France and came home in time for supper. In the Pacific, 800 miles was nothing. 800 miles barely got you off the front porch. Harlow had been staring at the same problem for months. Every morning, the operations board showed the same categories of targets. Coastal airstrips, supply depots in the jungle, logistics nodes that the Japanese would rebuild in a week. The crews flew out, dropped their bombs and came back, filed their reports, ate their food, went to sleep. And the war continued exactly as it had the day before. Harlow was 29 years old. He had grown up on a wheat farm in Kansas, the kind of flat, silent country where a man learns early to measure distances with his eyes and trust what he can calculate over what he's been told. He understood machines the way some men understand horses. Not from a manual, but from feel, from the way a thing moved under your hands when it was content, and the way it resisted when it was being pushed past its nature. He was not a man who talked a great deal. What he was, in the plainest terms possible, was a man who looked at a problem and did not look away until he found the thing that everyone else had missed. For 3 months he had been looking at Balikpapan. The city sat on the coast of Borneo like a crown jewel in a locked safe. It was an oil refinery complex, one of the largest in Southeast Asia, producing a massive share of the aviation fuel that powered the Japanese war machine. Every Zero that shot down an American pilot, every Japanese bomber that put a torpedo into an Allied ship, every engine that started over the Pacific in enemy hands was burning oil refined at Balikpapan. The American generals knew it. They had known it since the beginning. They looked at Balikpapan on the map and saw the throat of the Japanese Empire. But there was the distance. There was always the distance. Balikpapan was 2,600 miles from Fenton. The Japanese knew this too. Their base commanders had looked at the same charts. They had measured the same distances. They had concluded that the Pacific Ocean was a better defensive barrier than any wall they could build. Balikpapan had no serious fighter cover. Its radar stations were minimal. At night, the refinery ran at full capacity, with all its lights blazing, burning off excess gas in great orange flares visible for miles. They didn't even bother with blackouts. They were laughing at the Americans, not with words, with light. Harlow's idea came the way real ideas come, slowly, from the corner of the mind, in the dark, while everyone else was asleep. He had been reading the B-24 technical manual, not the operational summary. The actual manual with the engineering diagrams and the weight tables and the fuel consumption charts. One night he started writing numbers in the margin. The Sperry Ball turret, the spherical gun pod hanging from the belly of the plane, weighed over 1,000 pounds, not counting the gunner and the ammunition. The armor plating around the pilot and co-pilot seats added several hundred more. The waist gun mounts, the ammunition crates, the defensive systems that turned the B-24 into a flying fortress, together they represented thousands of pounds of dead weight, burning thousands of gallons of fuel that could have been used to close the gap between Fenton and Balikpapan. He wrote it all down. He ran the figures forward and backward. He slept on them, woke up, and ran them again. The range numbers shifted, not by a little, by enough. He took the idea to Sergeant Roy Thibodeau. Thibodeau was 24 years old, from a small town outside Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and he had been working on aircraft engines since before he could legally drink. He had the kind of mechanical intuition that cannot be taught, the ability to hear a problem in the way a machine was running and know what needed to be done before he even opened the cowling. His hands were permanently stained with oil. He slept with a wrench on his bedside table. Harlow laid out the numbers. Thibodeau looked at them for a long time without saying anything. Then he said, "You want to rip the guts out of a B-24? "I want to give it legs," Harlow said. Thibodeau looked at the numbers again. He picked up the pencil and added one more line, the weight of the auxiliary fuel tanks they could install in the bomb bay to replace the defensive systems. He put the pencil down. "It'll fly. The boys in Detroit will hate us for it, but it'll fly." Then Harlow explained the crew arrangement. On a standard B-24, 10 men shared the work. Navigator, bombardier, pilot, co-pilot, flight engineer, radio operator, 4 gunners. 10 sets of hands on 10 different jobs. Harlow's skeleton would fly with 4. Thibodeau would handle the engines. Lieutenant Cormac Sloan, a quiet, precise man from Boston who had never been wrong about a set of coordinates in 2 years of flying together, would navigate out, then move forward to the bombardier's position for the attack, then navigate home. The jobs that the other 6 men did, the guns, the radio, the defensive systems, those jobs would simply not exist. There would be no one to do them because there would be nothing left to do them with. Sloan, when Harlow told him, looked at the arrangement on paper for a long moment. Then he said, "I'll need to run the approach calculations before we cross the coast. Give me 30 minutes of dead air before the target." "You'll have it," Harlow said. That was the entirety of Sloan's response to being asked to do 2 men's jobs over the most dangerous target in the Pacific. They began the work in secret, at night, under the stars of the Australian outback, using flashlights and hand tools. Thibodeau pulled in 2 mechanics he trusted. Together, they began unbolting the things that were supposed to keep men alive. The ball turret came out first. Over 1,000 pounds of steel and glass and engineering pride lowered onto the tarmac with a sound like a quiet defeat. They covered the hole in the belly with a sheet of plywood. The armor plating came next, pulled from around the cockpit and stacked in the red dirt. The waist gun mounts, the ammunition boxes, the entire defensive architecture of the aircraft dismantled and left in the grass. In their place, Thibodeau installed additional fuel tanks in the bomb bay. Some were standard issue, some were improvised, metal containers plumbed into the fuel lines with rubber hoses and clamps. He checked each connection 3 times, then a 4th. When it was done, Harlow climbed into the stripped cockpit alone and sat in the dark. The plane felt different, lighter, more fragile. Without the turrets, the airframe had a different kind of quiet, not peaceful, but hollow. He put his hands on the controls and felt the plane breathe. He was sitting in a flying gas can, he knew it, but if everything held together, they could reach a target that no one believed they could reach. The order came down on a Tuesday morning. A general in the regional command had signed a new directive following a crash in New Guinea where a modified B-24 went down on takeoff. Effective immediately, all unauthorized modifications to aircraft were strictly prohibited. The penalty was court-martial. Penalty. The order was read aloud to the entire unit at morning assembly. Harlow stood in formation and listened to every word. That evening he found Thibodeau and said 4 words: "We work tonight, fast." 26 hours later, a young lieutenant named Crawford, 22 years old, someone who had told Harlow more than once that he wanted to fly like him someday, walked past the flight line and stopped. He stood looking at one of the stripped B-24s for a long moment. He could see through the open waist windows to the other side of the fuselage. He could see the plywood patch on the belly. Crawford was not a dishonest man. He filed his report that afternoon. Harlow found out within the hour. An inspector from command would arrive within 24 hours. He walked back to the operations room. He stood in front of the map. He put his finger on Fenton, walked it north to Balikpapan and held it there. Then he went to find Sloan. "We leave on schedule," Harlow said. "Tonight. Not 1 minute earlier, not 1 minute later, everything by the plan." Sloan looked at him steadily. "There'll be an order waiting when we get back." "I know. Arrest order. Already signed, probably." "Probably." Sloan said nothing else. He nodded once and went back to his charts. Among the other pilots preparing that night was a Tennessee man named Garrett, steady, experienced, someone who had been flying B-24s longer than almost anyone at Fenton and who had never, in 2 years of combat, missed a rendezvous point. He was the kind of man whose presence made other men feel that the situation was under control. He would fly the No. 4 aircraft. That night, 4 skeleton bombers rolled out onto the Fenton runway. They sat high on their landing gear, lighter than normal when empty. The wind moved through the gaps in their fuselages with a sound like breath through hollow bones. Harlow settled into the left seat, no armor behind him, no turret below, just fuel, 4 bombs, 3 men, and 2,600 miles of dark water between him and the most important target in the Pacific. He looked at the runway. The red dirt extended into the darkness until it disappeared. Somewhere behind the operations building, the lights of a staff car were moving toward the flight line. They were too late. Harlow pushed the throttles forward, and the skeleton ran. The wheels left the ground, and the world disappeared. One moment there was red dirt and a runway and the distant headlights of a staff car moving too slowly to matter. The next moment there was only darkness. The outback fell away beneath them, and the 4 skeleton bombers climbed into the black Australian sky, turning north, trading the solid earth for the thing that would either carry them or kill them. the Timor Sea. Harlow felt the plane in his hands the way a man feels a new tool, familiar in shape, strange in weight. The B-24 had always been heavy. Stripped of its armor, gutted of its turrets, the skeleton felt almost nervous beneath him, quick to respond. Light in a way that felt less like freedom and more like exposure. Like walking into a room without walls, he checked the fuel gauges, full, every tank they had, plus the auxiliary drums that Thibodeau had bolted and triple-checked in the bomb bay. Thousands of gallons of high-octane aviation fuel crammed into every space that wasn't already occupied by the 4 500-pound bombs they were carrying. The engineers in Detroit would have refused to sign off on it. The engineers in Detroit were asleep in their houses right now. Harlow trimmed the engines and began the long, slow climb to cruising altitude. Everything on this mission was a negotiation between speed and consumption, between altitude and range, between what you needed and what you had. He had run the figures so many times they lived behind his eyes now, present even when he wasn't looking at them. In the seat behind him, Cormac Sloane had already opened his charts. The Timor Sea at night was not a body of water. It was an absence, a vast, flat darkness that swallowed light and reflected nothing. No ships, no islands, no horizon, just the black water below and the black sky above, and somewhere between them, 4 hollow aluminum tubes carrying men toward a target that the rest of the world had decided was unreachable. The temperature dropped as they climbed. The B-24 had insulation built into the fuselage walls, layers of material that kept some of the cold out. Thibodeau had ripped most of it out along with the armor. The cold came through the gaps where the turrets used to be, through the plywood patch on the belly, through every seam in the stripped-down skin of the plane. At 10,000 feet it was brutal. At 15,000 it was a different kind of punishment entirely. Harlow leaned the engines. This was the art and the danger of the mission. The thing no manual could teach you and no training could fully prepare you for. The fuel-to-air ratio had to be cut back until the engines were running on the absolute minimum amount of gasoline required to keep the cylinders firing. Do it right, and you extended the range by hundreds of miles. Do it wrong, lean them too hard, push the cylinder head temperatures past the red line, and the pistons would melt and the plane would fall out of the sky. He watched the temperature gauges the way a doctor watches a patient in crisis. Any spike, any wobble in the needle, and he would back off the mixture just enough to bring it down. It was like driving with the warning light permanently on, trusting that the warning line was not the real limit. For 17 hours, in the bomb bay, Sergeant Roy Thibodeau was fighting a different war. The auxiliary fuel tanks he had installed were connected to the aircraft's fuel system with rubber hoses, metal fittings, and hand pumps. As the wing tanks began to draw down, someone had to go back into the bomb bay and physically transfer fuel from the auxiliary drums into the main lines. That someone was Thibodeau. He worked in slow, deliberate movements, attached the hose, primed the pump, began to crank. The fuel moved in sluggish pulses through the rubber line. Thibodeau counted the strokes, watched the drum level drop and the main tank gauge rise, fraction by fraction, in the cockpit where Harlow sat watching everything at once. One thought lived in the back of Thibodeau's mind while he worked. Not fear, exactly, just awareness. The awareness that he was a human being inside a metal container filled with enough volatile liquid to vaporize everything within 100 feet. That the difference between this moment and the last moment of his life was a single spark, a loose wire, a boot heel scraping a metal edge, a static charge discharging at the wrong instant. He worked slowly, he did not rush. He had learned early in life that the men who survived were rarely the fastest. They were the most careful. He pumped until his arms burned, then kept pumping. 4 hours out, Sloane picked up a signal. It was faint, a fragment of coded transmission cycling through a frequency he had been monitoring since takeoff. He didn't need to speak Japanese to understand the pattern. Short pulses, repeated intervals. The signature of a warning broadcast. He leaned forward and touched Harlow on the shoulder. Harlow pulled one earphone back. Sloane spoke quietly, directly into his ear. "Listening station picked us up. They're broadcasting a warning toward Balikpapan." Harlow looked at the compass, looked at the black water below them. The calculation was simple and brutal. They were already past the point where turning back and going home were the same thing. Turning back meant a different kind of arithmetic, one that ended in the ocean regardless. He reached over and switched off the radio. He looked at Sloane, said nothing, turned back to the instruments. Sloane understood. He put his headset on and returned to his charts. The skeleton kept flying north. What Harlow couldn't know, what none of them could know up in the dark, was what had happened on the receiving end of that signal. The commander at Balikpapan had received the warning from his monitoring station. He looked at it, then looked at his map, then looked at it again. He kept a small ruler in his desk drawer, used for exactly this purpose. For the moments when someone brought him a report that required reality to be measured against the known limits of enemy capability, he measured the distance from northern Australia to Balikpapan. He put the ruler down. He told his duty officer that the monitoring station was probably picking up commercial traffic, or perhaps a weather reconnaissance flight that had drifted off course. He said this with the patience of a man explaining something obvious to someone who should already understand it. Then he went back to what he had been doing. No one turned off the lights at Balikpapan. They were 9 hours into the flight when Borneo appeared, not as a shape, not as a coastline, as a glow, a low, warm light on the northern horizon that at first looked like the moon rising through cloud cover. Harlow stared at it for a full minute before he allowed himself to understand what he was seeing. He called back to Sloane. "You seeing this?" Sloane looked up from his charts, looked forward through the cockpit glass, and was quiet for a moment. That's it. It was the first time Harlow had heard anything close to emotion in Sloane's voice in 2 years of flying together. As they drew closer, the glow resolved into individual lights, street lamps, building lights, the orange flares of gas being burned off the tops of the refinery towers, sending columns of fire 50 feet into the air. The oil storage tanks, massive, circular structures arranged in neat rows, were visible as dark shapes between islands of light. Harlow had imagined this moment many times. He had not imagined feeling angry, but that was what he felt, not triumphant, not relieved. A deep, quiet fury at the arrogance of the lights, at the certainty they represented. The Japanese commanders had looked at the distance and concluded they were untouchable, and their conclusion had cost men their lives. American pilots shot down by planes burning Balikpapan fuel. The lights were not just light, they were a declaration. He keyed the intercom. "Sloane, move forward. Take us in." Sloane folded his navigation charts, moved through the narrow fuselage to the bombardier's position in the nose of the aircraft, and settled in front of the bomb site. He was now doing 2 men's work in sequence, exactly as they had planned on the ground at Fenton. He made his adjustments. He confirmed his calculations. His breathing was completely steady. The man had ice in his blood. Ice. The approach was nothing like any bombing run Harlow had ever flown. There was no coordinated flak, no searchlights sweeping the sky. The Japanese anti-aircraft crews were at their posts in the technical sense. Weapons were loaded and pointed upward, but the men were not alert. Why would they be? Nothing had ever come from the south. The southern approaches were safe. Everyone knew this. Then a single alert crew somewhere in the dark below heard something in the drone of the night sky that didn't belong. Not an identification, not a location, just an instinct sharp enough to act on. The flak started. Not accurate fire, not targeted, coordinated volleys from crews who knew what they were shooting at. It was the fire of confusion. of men who had heard something overhead and grabbed their weapons and began shooting into the sky without knowing where to aim. The bursts appeared in clusters to the left of the formation, then behind them, then far below. The Japanese gunners were guessing. They were firing at the noise of engines at an altitude they hadn't prepared for, from a direction they had never expected. But muzzle flashes lit the ground below like distant lightning, and muzzle flashes meant shells in the air, and shells in the air, even random ones, could end the mission. Harlow had one job now: hold the plane straight. Do not move the controls. Give Sloan his 8 seconds. In a normal combat approach, 8 seconds of straight and level flight was an eternity. Every instinct screamed at you to move, to jink, to put unpredictability between yourself and the guns. But without the armor, without the turrets, the skeleton could not absorb hits. A single 20mm shell through the fuselage would not damage them. It would end them. They could not trade hits for accuracy. They had to be perfect. Harlow put both hands on the controls and held. The city slid under the nose. He could read his instruments by the light coming up from below. That was how bright it was. Sloan, in the bombardier's position, looked through the sight and had the clearest picture he had ever seen in combat. No cloud cover, no smoke. Stationary target, fully illuminated, exactly where the reconnaissance photographs had shown it would be. A flak burst rocked the right wing. Not a hit, a shockwave from a near miss. The airframe shuddered. Harlow did not move his hands. He stared at the altimeter and breathed. Sloan said one word: clear. The plane lurched upward as the weight fell away. 4 500-pound bombs tumbling down through 8,000 feet of dark air toward a target that had never believed this moment was possible. Harlow immediately banked right, pushing the nose down, getting off the line before the gunners could correct their aim. He was already turning when the first explosion lit the sky behind him. He didn't need to look. The light was so intense it filled the cockpit from behind, throwing shadows forward across the instrument panel. He heard the sound a full second later, felt it more than heard it, a concussive pressure wave that moved through the airframe like a fist. Then the second explosion. Then the third. Then a deep, continuing roar that built and didn't stop, because what was burning now was not just the bombs. What was burning was everything. Sloan's voice came over the intercom, level as always. Direct hits, storage tanks, all 4. Harlow looked left. The horizon to the north was orange, not the orange of a fire, but the orange of a sun that had lost its bearings. The smoke was already rising in a column that climbed thousands of feet into the air, visible for 50 miles in every direction. Balikpapan was burning. For one moment, just one, he let himself feel what it meant. The impossible distance, the stripped plane, the figures that everyone said didn't work, the lights that were no longer lights. Then he looked at the fuel gauges, then at the compass, then at the 2,000 miles of black ocean between him and Australia. The hard part, he understood, had not been getting here. The hard part was about to begin. The fires of Balikpapan were still visible 40 miles out. Harlow could see them in the left cockpit glass, a smear of orange against the southern sky of Borneo, growing smaller but not darker, because what was burning was not something that burned quickly. Crude oil burns the way certain kinds of grief burn, slowly, completely, without apology. He turned south and put the target behind him. The skeleton felt different now. Lighter, with the bombs gone. But lighter on the return leg meant the fuel they had left had to cover the same 2,000 miles on less reserve than the flight out had used. The flight out was a straight line toward a known point. The flight home was a straight line toward a continent, and continents, when approached from across an open ocean in the dark, by dead reckoning and starlight, offer no guarantees. It was an argument between arithmetic and hope, and the ocean did not care which side won. Harlow leaned the engines back to minimum mixture and began the long, grinding work of survival. The Zeros found them 20 minutes south of Borneo. He saw them first as exhaust flames, thin blue streaks moving fast against the dark sky, the way you see fireflies in a field at night, there and gone and there again. Two of them, coming from the northeast, from the direction of the fighter field at Mangar, where the scramble order had gone out the moment the first storage tank exploded. Harlow did not reach for weapons. There were no weapons to reach for. He keyed the intercom. "Fighters, 2 o'clock high. Everybody know where we are." He pushed the nose down and went for the clouds. There was a broken layer at 6,000 feet. Not thick, not reliable, but it was what the night had given him. He aimed the skeleton at the darkest patch he could find and flew into it at full throttle, burning fuel he could not afford to burn, trading range for invisibility. The cockpit disappeared into grey-white nothing. The instruments were all he had: airspeed, altitude, compass, the artificial horizon telling him which way was up in a world where he could not see his own wingtips. He held a heading of 185 for 40 minutes. No one spoke. Either the Zeros found them in the cloud or they didn't. Either the fuel held through the evasion or it didn't. All of those questions were being answered in real time, and there was no point in discussing them. When the cloud broke, Harlow eased the nose up and scanned every quadrant of the sky in the slow, methodical pattern that combat flying teaches you. Low left, low right, high left, high right, check 6. Nothing. Behind him, he heard Thibodeau exhale like a man who had been holding air in his lungs for the better part of an hour. Then Sloane spoke, and the relief curdled. His voice was exactly the same as it always was, flat, precise, completely without drama. That was the thing about Sloane that Harlow had learned to read like weather. When other men got quiet because things were going well, Sloane got quiet because he was thinking. When other men raised their voices because things were going wrong, Sloane's voice stayed exactly the same. That evenness, right now, was not reassuring. "We have a problem," Sloane said. Harlow waited. 40 minutes in the clouds on that heading. The wind shifted while we were inside. We've been pushed east. A pause. The sound of a pencil on paper. 60, 70 miles off track. Maybe a little more. Harlow looked at the compass, looked at the Ishir, looked at the stars now visible through the broken cloud above. The Southern Cross hanging in the southeast, where it was supposed to be, but at an angle that confirmed what Sloane was telling him. "If we maintain current heading," Sloane continued, "we fly over open ocean. We don't find Australia. We find whatever comes after Australia." A pause. "There isn't anything." "Correction. 15 degrees left. Hold it the whole way home." "Fuel cost? We'll be close." Sloane did not say close when he meant fine. He said close when he meant the margin had become the kind of number that kept men awake. Harlow banked the skeleton 15 degrees left without another word. He did not explain to the rest of the crew what had happened. What would be the point? They were going the right direction now. The wrong direction was behind them. He had been carrying the possibility of this moment since before they left the ground. 2 hours south of Borneo, the No. 3 engine began to die. It went the way tired things go, gradually with small announcements, a slight roughness in the power delivery, a cylinder head temperature that climbed 2 degrees above where it should have been, then 5, then 10. Harlow felt it in his hands before the gauges confirmed it. He had been running these engines lean since Fenton, the full 17 hours out, and now deep into the return. The Pratt & Whitneys had been operating past their rated limits for longer than any maintenance manual assumed was survivable. The probability of this moment had always been acceptable. Acceptable was different from zero. He feathered the No. 3 prop before it could seize. The blade turned edge-on to the wind, stopping the rotation, reducing the drag from a dead engine to something manageable. The remaining 3 engines immediately felt the difference, their temperatures climbing as they absorbed the load. He reduced power slightly to protect them. The airspeed dropped. Slower meant longer in the air. Longer meant more fuel consumed per mile. The equation that had been tight before was now drawn thin as wire. He called back to Thibodeau. "What do we have left in the ox tanks?" A silence. The sound of movement in the bomb bay, of a man checking things by feel and gauge in the dark. 2 drums with anything in them, Thibodeau said. His voice was carefully neutral. Maybe 30 minutes at current settings, 40 if the wind helps. Harlow looked at the altimeter, did the calculation in his head, checked it, did it again. They were going to be short. He called it out to the crew, not as panic, not as catastrophe, but as a problem that required immediate action. The crew moved without being asked. The empty fuel drums went out the waste windows, tumbling into the dark. The gun mounts came off their rails and followed. A case of emergency rations. One of the gunners, a young man from Ohio named Prescott, who had not spoken since Borneo, picked up his parachute and held it for a moment. He looked at Harlow's back. He had noticed an hour ago that Harlow's parachute was already gone. Prescott set his own chute by the waste window and pushed it into the dark. The radio call came at 3 in the morning. The voice belonged to Garrett, steady, deliberate, the kind of transmission a professional makes when he has assessed his situation and arrived at a conclusion and sees no reason to dress it up. 4 engines, all cutting out one at a time. We're not going to make it. Harlow pressed the transmit switch. Garrett, heading? South-southeast, same as you. We're just short. A pause. Static. The sound of a man measuring his words carefully against the time he had left to speak them. Tell them we found it. The frequency went quiet. Harlow kept his hands on the controls. He kept his eyes on the instruments. He kept his heading at 185, 15 degrees left of where the wind had tried to take them, aimed at a coast that was still more than 3 hours away. He did not look away from the instruments. He did not speak. There are things that happen in war that have no adequate response, not because you don't feel them. You feel them with every part of yourself, all at once, in a way that ordinary life almost never produces, but because feeling them fully, in the moment, is a luxury that costs lives. You file them in the place where certain memories live permanently, the ones that surface at 3 in the morning for the rest of your life. And you keep flying. Harlow kept flying. The sun came up behind them. It rose out of the eastern ocean like a slow, indifferent fact, golden and enormous, throwing light across the water in every direction, beautiful, merciless. Thibodeau came forward and crouched beside Harlow's seat. He looked at the fuel gauges, did his own arithmetic, silently, the way a man counts what's left in his pocket when he's not certain he has enough. "We're going to be very close," he said, "I know. The last drum's almost gone. After that, we're on wing tanks only." Harlow leaned the engines out another fraction, past the point he had thought was the limit, into territory the manual didn't cover, because the manual assumed pilots would never be here. The cylinder head temperatures climbed and held. He watched the needles and breathed. Sloane appeared at the other shoulder, chart in hand, folded to the relevant section. He pointed to a position he had marked. Based on current ground speed and the star fixes from an hour ago, coast in roughly 90 minutes, if the wind holds. And if it doesn't? Sloane looked at the chart, then at Harlow. Then we'll see it from lower than we'd like. Harlow said nothing. He reduced altitude slightly, trading height for the marginal efficiency gain of denser air, buying distance one thin equation at a time. The engines ran, the gauges moved, the ocean beneath them went on and on. The coast appeared as a dark line, not dramatic, not glorious, just a subtle hardening at the horizon where the water ended and something else began, a line with a different quality, not the yielding, changeable edge of ocean meeting sky, but a fixed boundary. Land. Harlow saw it before Sloane called it. He felt something move through him that was not quite relief and not quite joy, something older and quieter than either. The feeling of a man who has been told repeatedly that something cannot be done, who has done it anyway, and who is only now in this moment beginning to understand what that means. He began his descent. The number 2 engine coughed once, twice, then smoothed out. He left it alone, kept the descent shallow, trading altitude for distance at the rate Sloane calculated with a pencil stub in the grey morning light. The coast resolved into red dirt and scrub. He could see the flat geometry of the runway at Fenton, a pale stripe in the dark landscape, the most welcome sight he had ever seen from altitude. He called the tower without formalities. "Fenton, skeletons inbound, 3 engines, minimum fuel." The tower came back immediately. "Cleared straight in, all runways yours." He dropped the landing gear. The drag hit the airframe like a hand pressing down on the nose. He held the speed with the throttles, coaxing the last calculation out of 3 engines and a tank that the gauges now showed as empty, which meant he was flying on what physics allowed before physics stopped being polite. The runway came up fast. He flared. The main gear hit with a crack he felt in his spine. The nose came down. He stood on the brakes, and the skeleton groaned and shook and rolled, using every foot of pavement Fenton had to offer. It stopped with the nose wheel dipping into the dirt at the very end of the strip. He cut the throttles. The engines ran for 4 more seconds on residual fuel in the lines. Then, one by one, they stopped. Not because he shut them down, because there was nothing left to burn. The propellers made one final slow rotation in the morning air, and then they were still. The cockpit was the quietest place Harlow had ever been. He was still sitting in the left seat when the staff car reached the end of the runway. He watched it come, moving fast, trailing red dust. It stopped 20 yards from the nose of the skeleton. 2 military police got out. They were carrying papers. Harlow unstrapped. He climbed down through the nose hatch, and his legs were uncertain under him for a moment. 17 hours of vibration, of every muscle held in sustained tension. He stood on the runway and felt the solid earth and looked up at the Australian sky, which was the clear, hard blue of early morning. The MPS walked toward him. One of them said his name, said the words that had been waiting for him since before takeoff. Unauthorized modification, violation of standing orders, pending court-martial review. Harlow looked at the skeleton behind him. The stripped, battered, exhausted machine that had gone 2,600 miles and come back on fumes, and the stubbornness of 3 remaining engines. He looked at the plywood patch on the belly, the empty windows where guns used to be, the oil streaks running back from the cowlings like dark tears. He put his hands out. They put the cuffs on him in front of the crew, in front of the ground men who had come running out from the hangars. Nobody said anything. Thibodeau watched from the nose hatch with an expression Harlow would remember for the rest of his life. Not anger, not helplessness, but the face a man makes when he understands that the world is not always logical and that understanding it changes nothing. Sloane climbed down last. He stood by the landing gear and watched them take Harlow to the car. Before they put him in, Harlow turned and looked at Sloane. Sloane gave him one nod. Harlow nodded back. 2 days later, the reconnaissance photographs arrived. They had been taken by a high-altitude aircraft that flew over Borneo the morning after the raid, and they were passed from desk to desk through the chain of command with a speed that classified documents rarely achieved. When they reached the general's table, He looked at them for a long time without speaking. Balikpapan was still burning. The storage tanks were gone, the cracking towers were twisted metal. The docks where the tankers had loaded oil for the Japanese Navy were debris. The smoke column was visible in the photographs as a dark vertical smear that meteorological analysis suggested would remain readable from altitude for another week. Japanese oil production in the region had been cut in half, according to signals intelligence. The Japanese High Command, looking at the same photographs from the other side, was trying to understand how land-based bombers from Australia had reached a target they had guaranteed was unreachable. They were pulling fighter squadrons from the front lines. They were repositioning anti-aircraft guns away from the beaches to protect facilities hundreds of miles inland. They were defending a perimeter that had suddenly expanded to encompass everything, because if Balikpapan was reachable, then nothing was safe. The geography they had counted on had been erased in a single night. The charges against Harlow were withdrawn that afternoon, not announced, not explained. A piece of paper was placed on the table in the room where he was being held. 2 words, return to duty. He looked at the paper for a moment. He thought about Garrett's voice on the radio at 3 in the morning. He thought about the 4 bombs falling through 8,000 feet of dark air toward a target blazing with its own confidence. He thought about Prescott pushing his parachute out the window. He thought about Sloan in the bombardier's position, saying one word with the same tone he used to read a fuel gauge. Then he picked up the pen and signed his name. There was no ceremony, no handshake, no letter of commendation read in front of a formation. The men who had done the impossible thing were released back into the ordinary machinery of the war, which had been running without them and would continue to run whether they were in it or not. Harlow walked back to the operations room alone, still wearing the flight suit he had taken off in, which still smelled of fuel and cold air, and the particular quality of fear that comes from being responsible for other men's lives over open ocean in the dark. He found the map on the table where he had left it. He spread it open under the lamp, put his finger on Fenton, walked it north to Balikpapan, and held it there for a moment, feeling the paper under his fingertip. Then he moved his hand east to the next chain of islands, the next set of targets that lay beyond where anyone had thought to look. He pulled a fresh sheet of paper toward him. He picked up a pencil. He began to calculate.